Over to, what's his name? He's no one. He's town historian in exile, he said. Frairy. I invited a few Frairy descendants. There aren't very many Frairy descendants, but there are a few in Massachusetts, and I invited them to it. Is anyone here a Frairy descendant? No. Okay, nice try. Go ahead, Richard.
That makes me feel much better. That makes me feel much better. There's no Frairy descendants here. So now if I say something, they're not going to get me on it. But thank you. I've been asked by the Historical Society to give you a vision of what life would have been like here for the Frairy family, John and Prudence and family, as they leave their home in contentment, i.e. Dedham, and settle in the new town of Medfield on the banks of the Charles River, what was called Bogastow. Now, John Frairy came to Massachusetts Bay Colony from England in 1636 with his wife Prudence and 3 sons. There was John Jr., Theophilus, and Samson. And born in America would be sons Eleazar, born in 1639, and Samuel, born in 1641. Now, it's Samuel who probably died in infancy. They first settled in Watertown, but moved to Dedham in 1638, where John was one of the founders of that town, and where, when the First Church of Christ was formed on November the 8th, 1638, he was one of the 8 men signing the covenant. Now, the Frairies came with a wave of English to the New World starting in 1630, known as the Great Migration. During a 12-year period, some 13 to 21,000 immigrants made their way here to Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Frairies were Puritans, and they left England primarily due to religious persecution, but also for economic reasons as well. England was in religious turmoil in the early 17th century. The religious climate was hostile and threatening, especially towards religious nonconformists like the Frairies. The Puritans were a sect of religious dissidents who felt the Church of England was too closely associated with the Catholic religion, and they needed to be reformed. They were not as radical as the Pilgrims, also known as the Separatists, who broke from the Church altogether. The Puritans wanted to stay with the Church, but they wanted to reform it. Here they could get away, make their reforms in the New World, far from the oversight of the Church of England, now an ocean away. The founding of Dedham came as a result of people moving there from earlier settled towns and villages like Watertown. Think of this. Here was a grant of land, some 200 square miles of American wilderness, at first appropriately known as contentment. That original Dedham grant included not only the current town of Dedham, but also the future towns of Medfield, Wrentham, Needham, Natick, Franklin, Bellingham, Wellesley, Walpole, Westwood, Norfolk, Norwood, Dover, and the Hyde Park section of Boston. There are few examples in all of human history in which mankind has been given a clean slate than the founding of Dedham. How exciting and historic this must have been for the Frairy family. Though they were under the broad guidance of the General Court here, most of how they chose to organize and what they chose to do, in the most immediate sense, was up to them. It was their town. In their covenant, which, following the lead of the Mayflower Compact, all early New England towns wrote as soon as they organized their town. This they all signed at the founding of the town. Among other things, John Frairy and the other Dedham settlers agreed to was that they shall take all means to keep out all that are contrary-minded, and receive in only such that may be probable of one heart with us. Those new settlers at Dedham, and then later at Medfield, expected that all townsmen would be of the same faith, and there could be no place for the contrary-minded. Those of different opinion would be warned off, if needed, like Roger Williams, Ian Hutchinson, Thomas Morton, and others, to be expelled or banished. These founders saw no contradiction in the idea that the ideal society was to be built upon a policy of rigid exclusiveness. Frairy and the others basically created a Christian utopian closed community. All were in step with Puritan ideology. Now, the lots given the first settlers at Dedham totaled 12 acres for married men, and this included an additional 4 acres of swampland. And that is what the Frairies received. Bachelors were given less, usually 8 acres. Now, the swampland were also ordered to be cleared. First, because they were home to wildcats and wolves. The wildcats and wolves presented a major threat to the well-being of the new Dedham settlers. The town actually employed full-time hunters, and they maintained a town-owned pack of dogs trained for the hunt. It was reported that 7-year-old John Dwight, son of one of the founders of the community, wandered off into the woods and was eaten by wolves in 1638. Swamp clearing also gave John an additional supply of wood. He needed the wood for cooking, heating fires, as well as used for building material. All this tended to deplete the wood supply rather quickly. By one estimate, an average family would, in the course of 1 year, for burning purposes alone, require all the wood from 4 acres of forest totally leveled, or from 20 acres selectively cut. Now, multiply that estimate by the 30 families in Dedham in 1640, and the amount of lumber required staggers the imagination. Restrictions were put on woodcutting on public or unallotted lands. Most people in Dedham could remember the total deforesting of trees in Boston within 3 years of the founding of that town. Not wanting the same to happen to them, John and the Dedham settlers established one of the first conservation projects in New England. For John, the swamp, once cleared, would become a bog, and a bog, once drained, would become a meadow. Here in the meadow, the cattle could graze. Another avenue for food supply for the cattle and other barn animals was the rich grass that grew along the rivers. This could be cut and stored for use in the snowy winter months. This supply of grass has been one of the major attractions to Dedham in the first place. The grass, to be sure, was not English grass, but it was good as might have until a better seed was imported from England, and was at least nutritious enough for the cattle. Now, the first mention of Dedham town records in what is now Medfield came in 1640, when Edward Allen was assigned 300 acres of upland and 50 acres of meadow, all to lie in or about the place called Bogastow. Now, Allen dies in 1642, but the land was laid out to his heirs in 1649. That land was afterwards bought by the new town of Medfield. While its exact location is not known, it is thought to be within the present bounds of Medfield. Now, since Dedham law stipulated that, quote, no house be built over a half a mile from the meeting house, end quote, it seems clear there were no dwellings built here before the land grants were given to the new town of Medfield in 1650. However, we do know that all owners of cattle would put them into common herds for pasturing in the burnt woods, or what was called the herd walks, under the care of a herdsman. Now, a hut or shelter was then built for that herdsman on his range, called a herd house. It is very possible that the Dedham men had such a house in what is now Medfield. If so, this would have been the first building ever created by white men on Medfield soil. Now, we also know that a herd was probably kept by Dedham people during the summer in the easterly part of what is now Medfield, sometime before the settlement was begun. Now, there is also evidence to suggest that the so-called Lucy Brand house, just past the cemetery on 661 Main Street, could contain part of one of those original herd houses. We know that the 661 Main Street house was in the Ellis family for 5 generations, and in 1758, the house was lived in by Lucy Brand, Medfield's last Native American resident. She dies in 1837. The house was later lived in by Samuel Green and his wife and 2 children who were descendants of slaves. The house is depicted in an 1889 painting called Roadside Cottage by Dennis Miller Bunker, and is exhibited today in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. A fire a number of years ago did considerable damage to that house, but under the careful restoration of present owners Brad and Betsy Phillips, the house was historically restored. So parts of that house may be the oldest in Medfield. For quite some time, John and the other Dedham men traveled out to the Charles River in what is now Medfield to cut the grass growing along the meadows in that river, which it still does today. They then journeyed back to Dedham with the grass to store in their barns for winter feed for their cattle and farm animals. Now, this was a lot of work and a great distance to travel when you're walking. And as a result, a movement was undertaken in Dedham to establish a new community out along the banks of the Charles River. Their plan was to get as much of the meadows on both sides of the river. Now, the east side already belonged to Dedham. The west side belonged to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. To carry out this plan, 2 grants would be needed. John must have been very involved in these happenings. A petition was sent to the General Court for a grant of land west of the river. This grant was given to Dedham on October the 23rd, 1649. The town of Dedham then held a town meeting on November 14th, 1649, and voted to set aside a portion of its original territory east of the river for the new town. With the 2 grants, the new town now had land on both sides of the Charles River. Those in Dedham saw some advantages in giving up a portion of their territory, as it would establish a buffer zone to protect Dedham proper in the event of an attack by Native Americans. Now, this would actually come true during the King Philip War, when Medfield took a blow in the attack that otherwise could have gone to Dedham. However, there was much debate in Dedham over the possible loss of land along the Charles River. Some in Dedham felt that the land should be freely given to those who would emigrate, while others felt there should be consideration of the fact that Dedham was losing much of its meadowland, and therefore the new settlers should pay £100 to be evenly divided among the remaining residents of Dedham. Town meeting debated and eventually voted the sum of £50 to be paid in consideration of the many and great changes lying upon the town. In 1650, Ensign Phillips, John Dwight, and Daniel Fisher were chosen by the town of Dedham and authorized to lay out the grant from that town lying east of the river. The men appointed by the General Court to lay out the land west of the river, now Millicent, part of Medway, completed that duty on May the 22nd, 1650. In the grant laid out by the General Court, the name of the new town was actually left blank. But the name was decided upon very shortly afterwards when it was probably inserted. The name had a number of different spellings in the early records, most frequently Medfield, M-E-A-D, and Medfield, M-E-D-F-E-I-L-D. To carry out the actual transaction and to manage the smooth division of land from Dedham to Medfield, a committee was selected by town meeting in Dedham. Among the first business undertaken by this committee was the writing of the covenant to be signed by all who wished to be accepted as official inhabitants of the new town of Medfield. While its author is not certainly known, there is little doubt that it was chiefly, if not entirely, the work of Ralph Wheelock, who has been proclaimed the founder of Medfield. Now, the Medfield Covenant very much echoes that of Dedham. Those settling in Medfield would do so, quote, to further spread the gospel, that differences would be solved in peaceful ways, that those entering Medfield would only be those who were honest, peaceful, free from scandal, and free from erroneous opinion. It's probably a good thing we don't have that today. All coming to Medfield were required to sign the covenant. However, after just a few years, this requirement fell into disuse. So I don't know what that says about those who came after that. The main road from Dedham into Medfield ran through the vicinity of what is today Clapboard Tree Street in Westwood, through the northeast corner of what is now Walpole, cutting through where roughly Bubbling Brook is, and then entering Medfield along Foundry Street. On June the 19th, 1650, the committee met again, this time to lay out 13 house lots. John Frairy was given 12 acres abutting the highway towards the southeast. The highway here referred to was the common around the meeting house, right here, right outside the window, which embraced the land now covered by the meeting house and meeting house, what is now Meeting House Pond, where we sit right now. Frairy's house lot lay along Frairy Street all the way up to Dale Street, and the house itself on the site just to the west of the current Dwight Derby house. The Frairy house and lot was later given to son Theophilus after John's death. Theophilus, living in Boston at the time, would actually donate the house and lot to the town and church in 1695. The house was torn down a few years later by vote of town meeting, and the proceeds were used to fence in the lot. This was afterwards divided between the town and the church, and a plan of it is actually inserted into our town records, and you can read that today. The church had a long, narrow piece next to the Dwight line, and the town had the remainder. John's meadow land was located on the west side of Stop River by Noon Hill, actually not far from where David and Marjorie Temple live. John built a bridge over the river to get to his meadowland. Replacement bridges over what became Noon Hill Road still bears the name today, Frairy's Bridge. Actually, Article 18 of the 1976 annual Medfield Town Meeting made it official that the name of the bridge is Frairy's Bridge. Now, local government in these New England towns were under the leadership of a board of selectmen. I see Selectman Gus Murby is here. He can kind of compare duties then to now. At first, as many as 7 would serve on the board for one-year terms. Later, it was dropped to 5 members, and then later, as in most New England towns, became a 3-member board. Those leaders would be the executive branch of local government. Now, John Frairy was a selectman in Medfield. in 1651, 53, 54, and 1661. Frairy and the other selectmen were the most powerful men in town. The selectmen were also members and leaders of the church. As selectman, John Frairy had immense prestige. He worked hard, giving time without salary. Most important, Frairy and the others, who were selectmen, had been chosen by their neighbors. By and large, those elected selectmen were the wealthier men in town. Frairy, in Medfield, in 1652 evaluation, had his evaluation listed as 316 pounds. Only Thomas White had a high evaluation of 322 pounds. The town wanted these men to be the town leaders, and they called them back repeatedly. Besides the selectmen, the only other town officer for many years was the town clerk. The selectmen made the taxes, received all the monies, paid all the bills, took charge of the school and highway matters, and in fact, took charge of all the town business affairs. Now, what were some of the issues that John would have been dealing with during his term as selectman? 1651 must have been the most exciting and important and time-consuming year for John. As the town was being laid out, new settlers were entering, the covenant was being written and enforced, the first mill was built, the first roads were being laid out, safety and wild animal concerns were abundant. I don't know if that's on your list of wild animal concerns or not. The turkeys. The church was organized in the autumn of 1651, and John played an active part in its formation. The church, no doubt, was organized before that, and the process of organizing had probably run through several months preceding. The forming of a religious society or a church among the New England Puritans of the day was very serious and a very deliberating process. Week after week, month after month, John Frairy and a dedicated group met in little groups in their homes, and they would deliberate upon the subject. And there was heart searching, fastings, special meetings for prayer, until at length, almost a year's deliberation and prayer, a church was organized and a minister called and settled. The first minister of this church was Reverend John Wilson, Jr., son of Reverend John Wilson, the first minister of Boston. Frairy would have also been involved in setting off, quote-unquote, the burying place, which consisted of what is now today the front and central portions of the present old cemetery on Main Street. The burying ground at first was common land and was soon covered with trees and bushes. Later, it was actually fenced in and let out as a cow pasture. In 1653, John Frairy would have had to deal with who would be allowed to cut the massive old forest, the virgin trees that went all along Vine Brook right behind us. He would have to deal with who would contribute to the new college in Cambridge. It was funny, when I was teaching school, I said to the kids, yes, he went to the new college. Does anybody know what the new college is? And the kid raised his hand and said, yeah, BC. These Irish Catholics. That, of course, was Harvard. New settlers would have had to be accepted as townsmen. The meeting house construction was begun. It was modeled after that in Dedham. It was probably 36 feet long, 20 wide, 12 feet high, with a thatched roof. John and the other selectmen would have formed a committee to burn the woods. This old Native American practice was kept up for many years. Led by John and the selectmen, town meeting passed a bylaw stating that all who failed to be at the annual town meeting by 9 a.m. would be fined 12 pennies. The South Plain was laid out in long, narrow strips, measuring from 3 to 20 acres each. That's the land behind, like the Wheelock School by Elm Street that way. More roads were laid out. In 1654, John and the selectmen pushed through a bylaw at town meeting stated that those who were absent from town meeting were to pay a fine of 12 pennies, but those who missed the entire day of town meeting would be fined 3 shillings and 9 pennies. It sounds like John was a stickler to making sure you attended town meeting. They also pushed a town meeting vote to require, quote, the whole force of the town, everybody, to give 6 days of work on the highway. 4 of those days had to be performed before June the 24th, unquote. In 1654, they also erected a town pound for stray animals. The original one was right behind us on Vine Brook. In John's 4th and final year as a selectman, 1661, Reverend Wilson's pay was debated and finalized. Plans for building of a schoolhouse was being debated. A new town law mandated every household having a ladder whereby the top of his chimney may be conveniently reached under penalty of 5 shillings. Think about this, with thatched roofs, house fires were a major problem in the town. Selectmen also banned the use of canoes in any pond, brook, or river, except by permission of the selectmen, under penalty of 10 shilling fine. Many people in these early colonies, not having swimming abilities, had drowned by means of canoes. Town meeting agreed to buy a bell for the meeting house here from Robert Hinsdale. The selectmen also laid out and accepted Dwight Causeway as a town way. Medfield was also at first infested with wolves, bears, and wildcats, as well as foxes and small predatory animals. Rattlesnakes were found numerous in those first years of settlement, and birds which preyed upon the crops became very numerous. Fur-bearing animals were common here in Medfield, and great quantities of beaver and raccoon skins were sent to market, and they formed a considerable source of income for people. Game was plenty. Wild turkeys soon disappeared. They came back. As aggressive as ever. And myriads of pigeons, ducks, and geese were to be had for the shooting. There were large numbers of partridges, woodcock, and quail. Moose and deer were often seen here in Medfield. The common red deer was much prized, both for food and for the skin, which furnished material for clothing. Fish were abundant. You got to remember that the Charles River in those early years was unobstructed all the way to the ocean. So shad and alewives ran up the Charles to their breeding grounds in the ponds as far as Medfield. Okay, I'm going to give you a 1-minute standing break. Can everybody stand up for a second? Just stretch for a second, do some push-up, forward rolls, a stretch. This is our intermission. Okay, we'll get you back in the seats. Okay, let's take a look at what life would have been like for the Frairies in the first year of this new Medfield community. On any given Sunday, the Frairies would be getting ready to go to meeting. As the meeting house, right here, was in sight of the Frairies' house over there, it would not take them long to get here, just crossing Meeting House Brook. Early Sunday morning, 1 hour after sunrise, they would hear loud and clear George Barber beating his first Sunday drum call, a signal for all to get ready to go to meeting. After another hour, the second drum call would sound out, this time from the top of the meeting house roof. He'd actually get up on the roof with this drum and beat away for better to be heard. Now, it had to be heard down by Bridge Street and across the Charles River out at the Sherburne Farms. Now, the tithing man appeared with his staff and set the front door of the meeting house ajar, so the early comers might get in out of the biting cold winter wind. There was no artificial heat in the building. When the Frairies approached the meeting house, they would see wolf heads brought in and nailed to the walls so as to get their bounty. The wolf was a marked animal in early Medfield and very destructive to the lambs, pigs, calves, and young stock, generally the most hated of all the wild beasts then infesting the town. Everyone was interested in having the wolf killed, and a large bounty was paid for every head of a wolf brought in. It was then nailed up to the meeting house wall, as the selectmen did not want to pay bounty on the same head twice. What was happening is someone would kill the wolf. They'd show it to the selectmen, who would pay the money. Then they'd give the wolf to their friend, who would take that same wolf back and and after a while the selectmen said, wait a minute, no. So what they did is they would cut the heads off, nail it to the outside of the meeting house. So when you came to church, here's the whole wall's covered with all these dead wolf heads. On the meeting house front door were posted notices. Early records we looked up show some of those notices, like, quote, Robert Mason intends to marry Abigail Eaton of Dedham, and, quote, strayed away from me, one red steer, 2 years old, has the Medfield brand on its rump, signed John Bowers, or, quote, town meeting will assemble on the 28th day of February, 1659, to see what bounty the town will allow upon grown wolves, squirrels, and blackbirds killed within the limits of this town, or do or act anything relation thereto. Signed John Frairy, Constable. People began arriving at the meeting house, furthest off arriving first that Sunday. As usual, that was George Fairbanks, coming from the farms, what is now Sherburne, close to the Millis line. Fairbanks and his daughter arrived so early that they went instead over to Joshua Fisher's Inn to warm up before the meeting. Soon the Bridge Street crowd was seen coming. Then the dwellers that lived here in the village, Mr. Wheelock, the Fishers, the Barbers, the Frairys, the Dwights, the Bullards, the Metcalfs, the Thurstons, the Whites, and others. Now the seats that they sat on in the meeting house were just rough board benches, no backs, less comfortable drowsing places than the modern pews. Fur bags were nailed on the front of many seats. These were made of wolf skin, into which people, especially the women, would thrust their feet during the long service to keep them from freezing. The men brought in their dogs and let them lie on their feet as sort of an animated foot warmer. The men sat on one side by themselves. The women and young girls sat on the other side. The boys had to sit under the pulpit where the tithing man could watch them for their behavior. And this is unbelievable here. Any females found to have lied, who were guilty of slander, or who otherwise were found to be lacking in integrity, had to sit during the service on, quote unquote, the stool of repentance, which was placed in the center aisle for all to see. Now the pulpit was elevated and made of oak. Now the Medfield Historical Society, you can see this afterwards, actually has a piece of the oak from that original pulpit from the first church that we have here. So we actually have a piece of that original wood of that first pulpit. When Medfield's minister, Mr. Reverend Wilson, and his wife appeared at the door, the tithing man would rap his pole and all would rise and stand while Reverend Mr. Wilson entered and sat at the pulpit. Several people then, quote unquote, put up notes, as it was called, which was read by Reverend Wilson. Here are some of them we found. Isaac Chenery for the birth of a son. Alexander Lovell on account of his wife's sickness. Gershom Wheelock for the death of an infant child. Or Eleazar Frairy being about to take a journey to the Connecticut River. The morning service would begin with singing from the Bay Psalm book. Since not many people had books, the first line was read by someone and then it was sung by the congregation. There were no instruments of any kind. Then came the long prayer by the pastor, and long it was, at least 40 minutes in length. All had to stand except women who had infants in their arms. Then another couple of psalms were sung. The hourglass was then set, and the sermon was begun. On this occasion, the hourglass had to be turned before the sermon was through. Now, this is going on 40, 50, 60 minutes, and you are sitting and you are listening and listening and listening, and after a while, you are going to fall asleep. So they had the tithing man. Now, the tithing man had a long pole. Sometimes there was a feather on it. And he would patrol up and down, watching. And if he saw someone falling asleep, he would go over and poke them or tickle them to wake them up. So you have, picture this, you have the tithing man patrolling up and down. You have dogs here laying on the men's feet. You have the poor lady on the seat of repentance in the middle. The sacrament followed, but the bread was often found frozen solid in the winter and would rattle in the plate like pebbles. Now came the noon hour. Those like the Frairies who lived nearby went home to get by their fireplace and have lunch. Now those who lived too far away went into a noon house that was built right outside the window next to the church, where they could sit around a fire with the smoke floating out a hole in the ceiling, and they would then eat their lunch, and they would be able to be warm. At the end of the hour, George Barber climbs up on the roof again with his drum, beats his drum, lets people know the service is about to begin, and all come back into the meeting house. When the people were once more in their seats, Reverend Mr. Wilson rose and said that important news had just come. News had come from England, and it gave him great pain to learn that our steadfast friend and ruler, Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell, was no more. It was feared by many, Wilson said, that his son, Richard Cromwell, would never be able to live up to his father's abilities, and that Prince Charles might come to the throne after all, in which case no man could tell what was to become of our liberties. The afternoon service began the same way as the morning. The psalms were sung and another sermon begun. In the middle of the sermon, two dogs who were not on good terms with each other went at each other, causing the tithing man with his pole to drive the two yelping dogs out of the meeting house. At the close of the sermon came confession time. John Ellis rose, and he said he was conscious of wrongdoing in that he had spoken disrespectfully of Deacon Bullen in alluding to his keeping Sarah Daniels, a young woman from Cambridge, in his family as a helper for his wife. His remarks he made to others were suggestive, unjust, and uncalled for. He also regretted having given way to his temper at firing at and wounding one of John Frairy's pigs that came across the brook into his garden. Reverend Wilson said that Goodman Ellis had made proper acknowledgement of his sins, his wrongs, but counseled him to have better care of his uncharitable judgment and hasty temper. The minister's wife then passed out to the meeting house, with all standing in their places until he was gone. Then all left, with the Frairies trudging on foot over to their home, where a blazing hearth fire and substantial meal made them feel welcome. Rude, yet home sweet home, ever no humble, there's no place like home. John was a cordwainer, a maker of boots, but like everyone else, he was a farmer by survival. Now what about Frairy's house that was over here? John would have had to build a house on his new lot. Again, it was just over here, across from the brook. It was here that his house was built. It was made of logs, good stout logs, straightened a little with his axe, where they would lie one upon the other to form the walls and lock together at the corners. The wind would not shake his house much, though it may find some crevices. But the cracks between the logs, John would have filled with wooden wedges and clay from the town clay pit down by Bridge Street. He never made an attempt to finish either inside or outside, All was very rustic. Inside Frairy's original house were 2 rooms. One large living room that was kitchen, sitting room, and workroom all in one. The other room on that first floor was the sleeping room. The house was 1 story, but it had a loft under the thatched roof where the Frairy children would sleep. It was reached by a ladder. There were 2 windows of English diamond glass, but in the loft and in the sleeping room, the windows were simply openings fitted with oiled paper panes, which let in a very light, subdued sunlight. In the middle of the house was a wide, heavy door through which John could bring in one of his horses dragging a big back log for the fire. At one end of the big room was a large fireplace, 10 feet wide, built of stone, laid in clay, with a broad chimney of the same material rising above the loft and above the thatched roof. As I mentioned, the thatched roof was at mercy of the sparks and embers from the fire, leading to that town law requiring that every household have a ladder long enough to reach the roof. Now in winter, against that rear wall of the fireplace would be that great back log which the horse drew in and which took the united muscles of John Jr. and Samson and Eleazar to put that into place. Piled in front would be a generous quantity of other wood, which set up a roaring blaze, giving a pleasant thrill of warmth to all in the Frairy family. Now the floor was strong enough to hold the weight of a horse and massive logs, because the floor was made up of trees split in half with the split side up, hewn into a somewhat smoothness, the rounded side bedeviled into the solid earth. John did build a small cellar under the sleeping room reached by a trap door. A few of his apples would have been stored there, along with turnips, cabbage, and other vegetables kept safe from the frost. His apple tree in the first years did not bear many apples. John had an old matchlock gun, some 7 feet long, which he had taken out against the bear or wolf or perhaps a deer. It was hung up across 2 stout pegs right near the door. For their meals, the Frairies would have a board in the main room, literally a wide board that they leaned against the wall until they were ready to eat. It would then be placed upon wooden sawhorses and made into a table. On the table they would have wooden platters, knives, pewter bowls, and spoons. Forks? No. The Frairies would not know what forks were, as there were none in use in those early colonies. They would often have meat for supper, where they would make use of their fingers with a lot of homemade napkins. As there was no baker in Medfield in those early years, there was no bread. Wheat did not thrive well in Medfield anyhow, and what little was raised would go to Boston, where it would bring in a good price. Over the fireplace would come something stewing and steaming and sputtering in the kettles over that fire, the odor of which would fill the entire room. When they were ready to eat, there was always one chair in the house left, and that was for a visitor who might stop in. John and Prudence sat side by side on a bench on one side of the table, and John, Eleazar, and Samson would stand by the board on the other side. A kettle of mush would be brought from the fire, and each would help themselves, cooling it in their pewter bowl with the milk that had been brought in from the cows in the barn. Next, a seething iron pot would be set on the board, holding stewed meat and vegetables. Now, Prudence might have remarked to John that, hey, this is some of the deer you shot down by Henry Adams' mill the other day. With the stew being finished, Prudence would go back to the fireplace again, but this time the lug pole on which the various kettles were hung had burnt off and suddenly gave way, forcing the remaining kettle with its contents to fall into the ashes and coal. There was great sizzling and steaming accompanying this catastrophe. But the ruin was complete. Nothing could save this wreck. "Oh no," said Prudence. "There goes my hulled corn that had been cooking all day long." She would then proceed to rake the ashes, bringing to view a nice baked pumpkin. A big hole would be made in the shell as it stood on the center of the board. The pewter spoons would be taken out and take out the savory sauce from within. They end their meals with a piece of cheese from which each cut up with their knife. When getting ready for bed, John would bring out the old black leather Bible and read slowly, "The Lord is my shepherd." And then he would stand and commit the keeping of his rude home in the wilderness with its beloved inmates to the heavenly protector of us all. John, Samson, Eleazar would climb up the ladder to the loft. John replenishes and banks up the fire. With Prudence, they settle into their bed. Then all is quiet within, while the wind howls without. The occasional cry of a wolf startles the dogs in the kettle out by the sheep pen, and the snow comes sifting down in the darkness. The Frairies lie snuggle in the realm of forgetfulness till another day dawns upon this primitive household. They arouse themselves to their round of homely duties once again, varied it may be by some news of what happened in Old England some 4 months ago, just brought out by some swift sailing vessel, and by recounting the little happenings among their rural neighbors in the infant settlement on the banks of the Charles River next to Bargestow called Medfield. Thank you. Questions at all on anything?
I'm curious, when did it actually go from 5 selectmen to 3?
I actually listed them. It was either late 1700s or in the early 1800s. We had the 5 selectmen, I think, into the 1800s. But we've been 3 for a long, long time. A number of towns still have 5, but the vast majority have 3. Yes?
I think I heard pretty announced how much time, how long the church service lasted. It was on Sunday, but some accounts I've heard suggest that the religious part was over and then the afternoon was just social time.
No, it pretty much followed. I mean, you still had that long sermon and you had the singing. So generally you're talking from about 9 to noon and then like 1 to 3 or 4. So basically all day Sunday. Plus Sunday was the day you could not do any work. You know, on Sunday it was supposed to be a day of rest, especially here in Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Were there any women who had higher positions in the society along with all the men?
Unfortunately, and we're, I think today, starting to make some headway, but back then, to answer you, there was very little. I mean, it's not until the early 1900s that, I mean, women don't get the right to vote until 1920, so I think Medfield was 1899, 1900, that the town voted a local election to allow women to vote for school committee. And we actually had, in 1899, the first female here in Medfield, even though you don't get the right to vote until 1920 nationally, that serves on the Board of Selectmen. But you're talking hundreds of years before. I mean, there's stories in the Revolutionary War of females that disguised themselves and helped in the war effort and things like that. But as far as being elected, town officials, sadly, there's very little in those early years. Hey.
You talked a bit about John Frairy starting to lay out some of the plans for the new school as one of the issues. What year was the first school built and who was allowed to go there?
The first school was built 1666 and it was located right where Nosh and Grog is. In fact, there's a plaque that's still there. And in those, that remained, several different buildings were built on that spot. That remained the school up until 1854 when they built the school on Pleasant Street, and that stayed there till 1940, 41 when it burnt. In in the 1700s, the town divided into school districts, so that remained the center school, but then you had a school that was in the north end of town, and you had a school that was in the south end of town. And then later, in the 1854, all schools came into that one building. So to answer your question directly, originally I think it would just be the boys that would go. I'm not sure, to be honest with you, when the first females went to school. That's a great question. I'll see if I can find that out. But in the beginning, unfortunately, it was men. And then Massachusetts was very big into education. Unlike in the southern colonies, we maybe had tutors that would go around. We required schools here. If you had more than 50 families, you had to have a school by law here. And if you had more than 100 families, you had to have a school to teach you to go to the college, BC. But so education was important here.
So prior to King Philip's War, you know, for the first settlers, what was the relationship like with the Native Americans that were in the area here?
The original grant, you got to go back to like Chickatawbut, that all this land supposedly was signed away. You didn't have, by 1649, there were no Native Americans living within the confines of Medfield. Later you had what was called praying Indian communities, Natick being the closest, so-called Christianized Indians that were set up. Metacomet was sachem of the Wampanoags. His headquarters was down in Mount Hope in what is Rhode Island near the Massachusetts border. But what they saw is every year more and more the English kept coming over, deals being made, less and less of the Native American land was left. And so after a while, I think Metacomet saw, if I don't take some action now, I'm not going to have anything left. Plus, the younger generation was seeing that, wait a minute, I have, you know, like nothing left. You know, I keep losing all my land, you know, that's there. So during the war itself, relations were horrible. I mean, they were, and when Metacomet, this is a horrible story, when Metacomet was killed in August of 1676, they cut his head off, put it on a pole, marched it down to Plymouth Common, where it stayed on that pole for some 23 years. They then quartered his body and hung a different quarter up on 4 different trees. They cut his hands off and put him in these vats of rum and actually passed them around from community to community so people could see that he was actually dead. So there was hatred, you know, that was there. So it was not pleasant at all. I think it's not until you get into the 1800s that a guilt conscience, I think, comes about, and then you begin to see things named after Native Americans and other things, which you see several here in Medfield as examples.
You're talking about Oliver Cromwell in your speech. So were the Puritans here in favor of Cromwell and his revolution, and so they were aghast at
Yes.
King James coming back?
Yes, and they were so afraid what was going to happen. Charles got back in, they were going to lose all their rights, and so that was a huge impact. That would have been, of course, it's 4 months. They're months and months getting the news, but when that news came, that would have been the topic of conversation.
So they were pleased when the king was beheaded originally?
Yes, 1649, which is, I can always remember that, the founding of Medfield was the same date.
How was the spelling of the town finally settled and when?
Well, in the early records, I found there's about 6 or 7 different spellings in those. I mean, people just didn't spell well. They didn't. And so this Medfield you see a lot. And over time, eventually, the continued records becomes Medfield. But in those first years, you had numerous different spellings, you know, of Medfield.
There's Medfield in England with a T.
Medfield, England, which is the theory of when the English came over, most times they named where they settled after the town they came from in England. So the theory here is that we know Ralph Wheelock and we know that the Bell and others came from this Medfield, England. So here's another of your spelling issues, that somehow did Metfield become Medfield. That's the general thought. I don't think we've 100% proven that, but that's the general belief at this stage.
Did Frairy write a diary, or how did you get all of that?
Well, all the records we have would be in the actual town records. He had no diary. So we're able to pick up years he was selectman. We were able to find he was constable. We knew that his son, which had mentioned on the notices, his son was going off to the Connecticut River Valley and wanted people to pray for him and keep him safe. We know that he went out and founded, that area of Deerfield, being one of the first settlers, to go out that way. And the reason we get, Dedham actually got that area when the town lost land, Massachusetts Bay Colony tried to make it up to them and would give them land in the central western part of the state that people could then move out and settle out that way. And that's what happened with Medfield. In 1713, Medway breaks away from us. So they take what is now Millis and Medway. So Medfield now lost a great deal of land. So the Mass Bay makes it up by giving us what is now today the town of Sturbridge, which originally was called New Medfield. And if you look at the history of Sturbridge, they're all Medfield people that settled that town.
I think you said that everyone had to live within a half a mile of the meeting house, but if everyone's getting 12 and 8 acres, did people not live on their actual land that they were farming? Or?
Well, no, in Dedham, there was 30 families. So, I mean, the reason they had that is that they feared either wild animals or Native Americans, or that you couldn't keep track of where the people were. So they wanted them within close view of that. So, but they would have meadowlands that were some distance away. But the actual dwelling house itself had to be within a half mile. And Medfield, in the beginning, followed that rule as well. We had 13 settlers. So most here were either given 6 or 12 acres of land.
You said that you got your information out of the town records. That wonderful narrative you gave about what happened on Sunday, was that in the town records?
No. That actually, in my sources, in addition to town records, to be clear here, came from Tilden's History of Medfield, came from a visit to an early homestead and a Sunday in the old meeting house by William Tilden. So that's where the bulk of that came from. And also Tilden's address in the book called The Proceedings from the Celebration of the 250th Anniversary of the Town's Incorporation. He gave an historical address. So I was able to all those piece that together. But he did a great job with the narrative.
What was the attraction of Deerfield? How did they figure, let's go west, and then they came up with the town of Deerfield? Was it the river?
Partially, but Dedham, it was land that was Native American land. We just kind of discounted that. But it was wilderness land that Mass Bay could give Dedham, because Dedham lost a chunk of Medfield and other lands out that way. But it is by the river. I'm not sure how they exactly picked that one spot, the same as Sturbridge in the case of Medfield. But you do have the Deerfield River that's right there, farming that's there, you get the mountains nearby.
The Connecticut, too.
Connecticut, not too far, yeah.
I know that communications between Montreal, was it the war up there or something that came to Boston by way of Deerfield?
Well, you had the French and Indian Wars. You had a whole series of wars. After King Philip's War, really it's not the last. You have a whole series. King George's War, Queen Anne's War, the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War that take place. So there's very few periods of time that there's not some friction between the Native Americans, especially in the western part, what is now New York, that area, going on up into Canada, in that area. And after the King Philip War was over, many Native Americans here fled up that way for safety to be with other Native Americans, knowing they were sold into slavery down here. I mean, it was awful what we do to the Native Americans following the King Philip War. They were hanging them in Boston Common. Monaco, also called One-Eyed John, who's responsible for burning Medfield, was hung on Boston Common.
When Medfield was first settled, did you think it was mostly wooded and was a lot of that clear cut?
No. There's more trees in Medfield today than there were in 1649 because the Native Americans burnt, they did a burning because they wanted the berries and the bushes to grow, and once the settlers came in, they needed that wood for burning, for building. So Medfield was wide open plains. They said the first settlers that came in, when they came in, they, from Frairy Street, went up to what is now Mount Nebo. And they named it Mount Nebo from the holy Mount Nebo, which is in Jordan today, where, if you read your Bible, Moses looked out over the Promised Land. Well, these settlers looked out over this Promised Land from Mount Nebo. And they could see all the way to the Charles River. This was open plains. So there are more trees today than there were in 1649.
So then where did they get, I mean, if we were all, because that's all I know, it's called Medfield, and that kind of thing. Where did we get the wood? Did we go to neighboring areas to get it? Or?
No, well, I mean, it wasn't like we were a desert or something. I mean, there were trees. There were trees here. And along the
About to build 13 homes.
Sure, along Vine Brook with the old forest, these massive, and that's why when you look at the old houses, you see the floorboards that are so wide. I mean, these trees were massive, you know, that were there. So, you know, a couple of those would be a lot. But the selectmen had to rule who could cut those down because, as it said, in 3 years, Boston was totally deforested. So, I mean, there were trees here enough, but they had to be careful of that. And eventually you would keep moving out, you know, as more settlers came in.
I thought I read somewhere in our books that they were given a tree lot and much of that was down there in Rocky Wood.
It may be. I'm not familiar with that. Every settler given a tree lot? There was common land that trees were on. It could be. I'm just not familiar that I know each resident was given meadowland, because that was the most important part, to get the grasses and stuff with that. It could be. I'm just not aware of that. Okay, well, thank you very much. There's food up there. Thank you.